The stars had always been a source of wonder. From the earliest moments of human history, they had fascinated and terrified in equal measure. But in the year 2145, the stars became something more. They became a message. The news broke first in hushed whispers, then spread like wildfire across the globe. Dr. Elias Cade, the world-renowned astrophysicist, had made a discovery that could change everything. An SOS, a signal from deep space. It wasn't just any signal. It was deliberate, precise, and pulsing with an energy that defied explanation. It came from the Andromeda Galaxy, a place humans had scarcely explored, lying over 2 million light-years away. The timing was as disturbing as the message itself. It arrived at a moment when the human race was teetering on the brink of collapse. Global warming was worse than ever, food shortages were growing, and political strife had fractured nations into warring factions. The future looked bleak, and humanity's focus was inward. But the signal had changed everything. Dr. Cade sat in front of the massive communication array at the Institute of Galactic Research, his tired eyes scanning the transmission once more. The flickering lights on the panel reflected in his glasses, creating a ghostly halo around his face. A part of him wished the message had never come through. He'd spent his entire career studying deep space, hoping to find evidence of alien life. But this was different. This wasn't a discovery. This was a warning. The signal, though faint and fragmented, had a rhythm to it, an undeniable urgency. It wasn't just a message sent out of curiosity. It felt desperate, like a cry for help. Dr. Cade had analyzed it for days. He'd run it through every algorithm, every pattern recognition software known to humanity. There was no doubt. It was structured. It had intelligence behind it. But even more troubling was the content. The message wasn't long, and much of it had been degraded by the distance and the interference of space, but some words were crystal clear. Help. They are coming. Too many. No time. The hairs on the back of Cade's neck stood up as he replayed the transmission again. A soft, mechanical voice hummed in the background as the message looped over and over in the lab. There was a sense of finality to it, as if whoever had sent it knew it was already too late. The room around him felt suddenly claustrophobic. His breath quickened, and his pulse pounded in his temples. The message was too real, too vivid. A sense of dread filled him, a dark realization that humanity might not be alone in the cosmos, that something was coming. As the realization sunk in, Dr. Cade quickly reached out to the global coalition that oversaw space research, sending out an encrypted message to the leaders of the world governments and the scientific communities. The response was swift. Within hours, the entire world knew about the SOS, and soon, the world's leaders were meeting in a joint summit to discuss what could be done. The first response was one of skepticism. The governments of Earth, already struggling to maintain order in the face of mounting crises, were quick to dismiss the signal as a hoax. It wasn't until Dr. Cade made a public statement, confirming that the signal had been verified by independent scientists, that the world began to take it seriously. A few rogue factions tried to exploit the situation, hoping to seize power by playing on the global panic, but the evidence was undeniable. The signal was real, and it wasn't the first one. As the analysis continued, Dr. Cade and his colleagues uncovered disturbing patterns, long-lost frequencies scattered throughout deep space. They were remnants of other civilizations that had once stood on the brink of destruction, much like humanity was now. The similarities were uncanny. Each SOS was from a culture at war, each call for help leading to the same inevitable conclusion. The data was damning. The signal wasn't a random occurrence. Someone, or something, had been wiping out civilizations in a consistent, systematic way, moving through the galaxies, leaving nothing behind but ruins and whispers. This was the enemy, the force that had already destroyed countless advanced species, and now it was coming for Earth. Dr. Cade had no answers for the world's leaders when they demanded an explanation. He could only say one thing with certainty: they are coming. Within days, the first joint military task forces were assembled, tasked with investigating the origins of the SOS and understanding what the unknown force could be. Humanity's most advanced technology was directed to the mission. Satellites, space probes, and experimental ships were all mobilized in an effort to decode the message and prepare for what was to come. But even as humanity turned its eyes to the stars, there was a sense of growing unease. The search for answers felt futile, as if humanity had already been judged and found wanting. As the tension grew, so did the question of how the world would respond. The SOS had triggered something deeper within humanity, something dark and primal. It wasn't just a warning from the stars. It was a test. And humanity, with its unyielding pride, would not face this test lightly. The world governments, already unstable, began to fracture. Nations that had once been allies turned against each other. The European Union, once a symbol of unity, was the first to break apart, with member states squabbling over how to approach the crisis. The United States, dealing with its own internal divisions, found itself split between factions vying for control of the space assets. The newly formed Asian coalition, which had spent years negotiating peace, was thrown into chaos as each country scrambled to prepare for the unknown threat. But it wasn't just politics that was fractured. The human psyche was splintering too. There was something about the SOS, something in its tone, that sparked a deep, almost instinctual reaction in people. Fear. And where fear took root, fury soon followed. It was a fury unlike anything humanity had ever experienced. This wasn't just the rage of battle-hardened soldiers or the anger of nations on the brink of collapse. This was a fury born of desperation. A fury that arose from the realization that there was something out there, something ancient, that humanity was powerless to stop. Something that had already eradicated countless species. Something that was coming for them. And as the first artifact was discovered, buried deep within the ruins of an ancient space station at the edge of the solar system, the fury reached a new height. The artifact was unlike anything humanity had ever seen. It was an object of pure metal, smooth and seamless, with no clear markings or purpose. It radiated an energy that was both captivating and terrifying. But as humanity's best minds scrambled to unlock its secrets, they uncovered a chilling truth. This artifact was a key to unlocking more knowledge, but also a key to unlocking something much worse. Every artifact, it seemed, was a weapon. A tool designed by a civilization that had faced the same enemy. And as each new artifact was discovered, more questions arose. What had this ancient civilization done to survive? Had they found a way to defeat the enemy? Or had they, too, succumbed to the same fate? Humanity's hope began to dissolve into paranoia. The race to find the artifacts turned deadly as rival factions fought to control them. Some wanted the power for themselves. Others wanted to use the knowledge to protect humanity. But there were those who simply wanted to end the threat at any cost, no matter the consequences. The entire world was on the brink of war, not just with each other, but with the unknown force that was coming. But as the pieces fell into place, Dr. Cade made a horrifying discovery. The artifacts weren't just relics of a lost civilization. They were a warning from a race that had fought and lost, a race that had encountered the same enemy, and now that enemy was coming for Earth. The SOS had triggered a chain reaction, a relentless fury that would consume humanity itself. In the face of the unknown, humanity's desire to survive became its greatest weapon and its greatest curse. Because survival didn't just mean defeating an enemy, it meant conquering the very essence of what made humanity human. The signal, it seemed, had been the spark, and now there was no turning back. The world stood on the precipice. The discovery of the SOS had sent shockwaves through humanity's collective consciousness, and with each passing day the gravity of the situation deepened. Governments that had once seemed stable and unshakable were now crumbling, their foundations rattled by fear, suspicion, and the very real knowledge that something catastrophic was on the horizon. The message had been clear: help, they are coming, too many, no time. It had echoed in the minds of every leader, every scientist, every person who had heard it. And now, they were all caught in a race against time. Dr. Elias Cade had not slept properly in over a week. The signal had consumed him, eaten at his every waking moment. It was as if the words themselves had burrowed into his soul, refusing to leave. Despite the overwhelming scientific breakthroughs that had come in the wake of the signal's discovery, there was still no understanding of what lay behind the message. No one knew who had sent it, or what this impending threat truly was. The ancient alien civilization that had once shared a kinship with humanity, the civilization that had left the artifacts strewn across the galaxy like breadcrumbs, remained a mystery. And with each artifact they uncovered, the questions grew, never the answers. At the heart of the global response was a sense of urgency. Humanity was caught in a race, against time, against each other, and against the invisible enemy that loomed over them. The discovery of the artifacts had sparked fierce competition. Each one that had been found was more perplexing than the last, and each held clues to a past that seemed to exist in another age, another time entirely. They were relics of a civilization long gone, yet their significance was undeniable. Hidden deep within them were the keys to understanding the force that was coming for Earth. But the discoveries, instead of bringing humanity together, had only driven it further apart. Once, the nations of the world had been united in their efforts to explore the stars, but the arrival of the SOS had fractured their unity. Every faction saw the artifacts differently. Some believed the pieces of ancient technology could be used to defend Earth, while others sought the power within them to control the fate of the planet for themselves. In the United States, the political elite had already begun jockeying for position. The government's military-industrial complex, once a monolith of power, was now split into factions, each vying for control over the space agencies and the discoveries that had been made. The more conservative factions, the artifacts as weapons to be wielded, not just for defense but for dominance. They pushed for rapid militarization, for weapons research, for an offensive strategy to ensure humanity's survival, regardless of the cost. In Europe, the European Union, already teetering on the brink of collapse due to economic instability and rising nationalism, was now facing an internal divide that threatened to undo the very fabric of their once unified continent. Nations that had once been bound by treaties and common goals were now suspicious of each other's motives. The SOS had triggered not only a global panic but a reversion to nationalistic sentiments. Governments that had once worked together to tackle issues like climate change and global poverty were now pointing fingers, questioning the loyalty of their neighbors, and hoarding what little resources remained. Across the Pacific, the Asian coalition, the economic powerhouse of the future, was plunged into a state of emergency. As the planet's largest and most powerful bloc, they understood that control over the artifacts meant control over humanity's future. The power to secure the survival of their people was within reach. But with that power came a price. The Chinese government, with its military might and technological capabilities, immediately mobilized forces to secure the artifacts. But Japan, South Korea, and India, each with their own technological expertise and military forces, saw the Chinese move as an attempt to seize dominance. They, too, deployed their forces, escalating tensions in the region. It wasn't just a race to find the artifacts. It was now a war for them. And then there was the global underground network. As soon as the first whispers of the SOS had spread, underground factions, rogue states, and private corporations began to gather their own intelligence. The search for the artifacts became not only a matter of national interest but also a lucrative business. Some saw it as a chance for unimaginable wealth, while others, more shadowy, understood that the true power of the artifacts lay in their potential to reshape society itself. The true motives of these groups were unclear, but they operated in the shadows, manipulating events and seizing artifacts when the governments of the world were too slow or distracted to act. All the while, Dr. Cade continued to work tirelessly on his analysis. The SOS had become his obsession. But as the days stretched into weeks, he began to feel the crushing weight of the situation. Each new discovery only deepened his sense of dread. As the signal had warned, there was no time. The enemy was coming. And then it happened. The first major breakthrough came on a desolate, forgotten moon orbiting a gas giant on the outskirts of the solar system. A joint mission, led by the European Space Agency and the Chinese Space Initiative, had uncovered the most significant artifact yet, an enormous sphere buried beneath layers of rock and ancient debris. It was smooth and perfectly spherical, with an eerie glow emanating from its core. When the artifact was uncovered, the world watched with bated breath. This was the key, or so they thought. But when the sphere was activated, the results were far from what anyone had expected. A ripple of energy, unlike anything seen before, coursed through the solar system, washing over Earth's communication satellites and power grids, rendering them useless in an instant. The artifact pulsed again, sending a shockwave of energy through the space agencies, knocking out their equipment and cutting off all communication with Earth. For a moment, it felt as though the world itself had stopped. The artifact was clearly more than a mere relic. It was alive. It was a beacon, but a beacon for what? In the panic that followed, world leaders scrambled to restore order. But there was no way to reach the astronauts on the moon, no way to understand the artifact's true nature. No one knew whether the sphere had sent out a signal or if it had simply activated something dormant in the universe. There was only uncertainty. The race for control had escalated to dangerous levels, and now humanity had to reckon with the very real possibility that the artifacts were not just weapons, but harbingers of an impending doom. Back on Earth, Dr. Cade was summoned by the United Nations, whose emergency council had been convened in response to the crisis. The meeting was to be held in the United States at the highest level of security. As the world's leaders convened, they were under pressure to make a decision. What did the artifacts mean? How could they use them to defend humanity? Or were they meant to be destroyed? Dr. Cade was ushered into the meeting room, his thoughts spinning with the questions that had consumed him for so long. He took his seat at the long table. The faces of the world's leaders turned toward him. Every nation had sent a representative, every country that still held some semblance of power, that is, and the tension was palpable. No one knew what to expect. Everyone was terrified. He began to speak, his voice steady, though he could feel the weight of history pressing down on him. The artifact we've uncovered is not just a relic. It's a key to something much larger than any of us can comprehend. What do you mean by key? The question came from the French representative, a sharp-aimed woman who had been more than skeptical of Dr. Cade's findings. It's a signal, Cade replied, a warning, a message sent across the galaxy long before our time, a message from a civilization that encountered the same enemy we now face. And the artifacts? They are more than tools. They are mechanisms designed to help us understand this enemy, but in doing so they also open a door to something we are not ready for. The room fell silent, the weight of Cade's words settling over everyone. This wasn't a hopeful discovery, it wasn't a gift from the stars, it was a reckoning. The enemy, as we know, is coming, Cade continued, his eyes now sweeping over the faces of the leaders. And unless we can learn from the mistakes of the civilizations before us, we will not survive. The leaders exchanged glances, and in that moment, Dr. Cade realized something. The race for the artifacts, for control over their power, had already begun to overshadow the true threat they faced. Humanity wasn't just at war with an unknown enemy. It was at war with itself. The room erupted in debate, but in the back of his mind, Dr. Cade knew the truth. The artifacts were not the answer. They were merely a reminder of what would happen if humanity failed to unite. And as the meeting continued, he could feel the darkness on the horizon, an impending storm that would tear the world apart if humanity didn't find a way to come together. The enemy was coming. And they would not wait. In the days that followed the disastrous activation of the artifact, the world seemed to descend into chaos. The sudden surge of power from the sphere had left much of Earth in a state of technological paralysis. Power grids flickered out across entire continents, communication satellites were knocked offline, and a sense of helplessness spread like wildfire. Governments scrambled to re-establish control, but the very systems that had allowed them to function had been crippled. All the while, nations that had once united in the pursuit of scientific knowledge were torn apart by suspicion, ambition, and fear. Dr. Elias Cade, though, had never felt more certain of one thing: the world was running out of time. The artifacts, once seen as humanity's salvation, had become harbingers of doom. Each one unlocked more questions than answers, and the more humanity learned about the ancient civilization that had left them, the more they realized the fragility of their own existence. The SOS that had first brought hope now loomed over them like a dark omen. They had all been warned, but they hadn't been prepared. And now the threat was close, too close for comfort. The United Nations Emergency Council had convened again, but this time the mood was different. The urgency had shifted from curiosity to desperation. The members were no longer concerned with diplomatic niceties or scientific debates. They were terrified. Dr. Cade had been summoned once more to provide his insight, but the questions had changed. No longer were they asking about the artifacts themselves. Now the focus was on how to use the knowledge gleaned from the artifacts to fight the coming enemy. The entire world was now gripped by one fundamental question: how could they survive? "Dr. Cade, we need an answer," said the American representative, a gruff military officer named General James Dalton. His face was tight with strain, his normally steely demeanor now cracked by the weight of the crisis. "The artifacts. What can they do to help us fight whatever's coming?" Dr. Cade looked around the room, taking in the faces of the world's leaders, each one on edge. Some looked hopeful, but most were filled with dread. They had seen the failures of past civilizations. They had seen how those societies had been annihilated by an unknown force. The history lessons of ancient wars and lost empires felt more like a warning than a lesson now. A terrible, undeniable truth was sinking in. They were at the mercy of something far older, far more powerful than any weapon they could wield. "The artifacts, they aren't weapons," Cade began, his voice quiet but steady. "At least, not in the way you think. They're pieces of a larger puzzle, an ancient, broken puzzle. We've only uncovered a fraction of it so far, and what we have found has been more of a warning than a weapon. Each artifact contains fragments of knowledge, remnants of a civilization that fought and failed against the very threat we're now facing. This enemy is not something you can defeat with technology alone." General Dalton's jaw clenched. "So what are you saying? We have no chance?" Cade met his gaze without flinching. "I'm saying that we don't know enough yet. The artifacts are part of a larger network, some kind of defense system, or at least a clue to the defense of this ancient civilization. But it's clear now, this enemy isn't something we can simply bomb or shoot down. It's not a war of weapons, General. It's a war of survival, and so far, humanity hasn't even begun to understand what that means." The room fell silent. The weight of Cade's words hung heavily in the air. Outside the room, the tension in the streets of every major city around the world was palpable. People were angry, confused, and afraid. The sudden collapse of the world's infrastructure had left millions in panic. Without electricity, without communication, entire populations were in disarray. The economy, already fragile due to years of climate disasters and political instability, was on the verge of collapse. In China, the military had seized control of key spaceports, intending to secure their own artifacts and technology. The government had been quick to label any competitors as enemies of the state, turning the race for the artifacts into a de facto global arms race. Tensions were rising between nations, with military buildups and skirmishes occurring along disputed borders. Even within countries, factionalism was spreading like wildfire. The United States, once the beacon of hope and democracy, had fractured into warring factions, each vying for control of the few remaining resources. But it was in the shadows of these conflicts where the real danger lay. While governments and militaries scrambled to prepare, rogue factions, private companies, and underground groups began to exploit the chaos. These were not simply opportunists. They were true believers, convinced that humanity's only chance at survival lay in harnessing the power of the artifacts for themselves. Some saw them as tools for domination. Others saw them as keys to unlocking an ancient power, capable of not only surviving the enemy's arrival, but of ultimately controlling it. Dr. Cade knew better than anyone that this was a dangerous path. The more he studied the artifacts, the more he realized that these weren't just objects. They were relics of a lost civilization, one that had encountered this same enemy and been destroyed. If humanity was to survive, they needed to understand the lessons of those who had come before them, and they needed to do it quickly. Every day that passed, every hour, brought the enemy closer. The ancient warning had been clear. There was no time to waste. But not everyone saw things the way Cade did. Some leaders, particularly in the military factions, were ready to go on the offensive. They believed that if humanity could develop the right technology, something from the artifacts, they could fight back, strike first, and prevent the enemy from ever reaching Earth. Others, especially within the scientific community, felt that there was still a chance to learn from the past, to uncover the lost knowledge that might provide a solution. But the question remained, what could they learn in time? In the days that followed, the tension in the global community reached a fever pitch. Every major space agency was involved in the race to decode the artifacts. No one could afford to waste time, and the stakes were growing higher with each discovery. The race was on, and every nation believed that it could be the one to unlock the final piece of the puzzle. Meanwhile, in the hidden corners of the world, the underground factions began to make their moves. They had no loyalty to any government, no allegiance to any nation. Their loyalty was only to the artifacts and to the power they could unlock. These rogue elements had been planning for this moment for years, stockpiling resources, recruiting talent, and waiting for the chaos to spill over. They were the wild card in this already volatile game. Dr. Cade's work had placed him at the heart of this conflict, and his expertise had made him a target. He had become a symbol of hope for some and a liability to others. As factions within his own government began to pressure him to deliver results, real, actionable results, the pressure mounted. It became clear that they didn't care about the truth. They didn't care about the ancient civilizations, the warnings, or the lessons to be learned. They cared only about one thing, survival. And if that meant exploiting Cade's knowledge, using him as a pawn in their own plans, so be it. But Cade wasn't interested in power. He wasn't interested in saving a government or a nation. He was interested in saving humanity. And to do that, he knew he had to find the answer before it was too late. The race for the final artifact had brought Cade to a remote corner of the galaxy, to a place where ancient ruins lay hidden beneath a barren moon. There, buried in the debris of a forgotten age, was the key to understanding the full extent of the threat. But as Cade's team prepared to launch their expedition, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The enemy was closer than they thought. The signal wasn't just a warning, it was a call to action. When they arrived at the moon, Cade was the first to step off the shuttle, his boots sinking into the dust. The air was thin, the sky a dark, lifeless expanse. Around them, the ruins of an ancient city lay scattered, their structures crumbling under the weight of centuries. This was it. This was the last chance to find the truth. As they navigated the ruins, Cade's heart raced. There was something about this place, a sense of unease, that made every step feel heavier. And when they uncovered the final artifact, an ancient stone tablet covered in alien symbols. The truth hit him like a hammer. The tablet wasn't just a map, it was a warning, and it was encoded with something far more chilling. It was a recording of the end of the ancient civilization that had once occupied this planet. It was the final, desperate cry of a people who had failed to stop the oncoming wave of destruction. And, as Cade watched the ancient hologram flicker to life, he saw the enemy for the first time. It wasn't a ship, it wasn't an army, it was something far worse, an unstoppable force of nature. The ancient civilization had been wiped out not by weapons, but by the very fabric of reality itself. Their cities had collapsed, their people consumed, their very existence erased. The enemy wasn't an entity, it was a force of entropy. As the truth sank in, Dr. Cade realized with chilling clarity that the enemy was not a force they could fight. They could only survive if they found a way to escape it. The moment the hologram flickered to life, Dr. Cade's breath caught in his throat. The ancient civilization, long extinct, had left behind a warning that humanity was only now beginning to understand in its full horror. What had once been thought of as an impending alien invasion was, in fact, something far more terrifying, a force that consumed reality itself. The hologram, though incomplete and fragmented, showed the final moments of that lost civilization. The images were jagged, like broken shards of a once beautiful picture. Cities that had thrived in vibrant harmony suddenly crumbled into dust. Monuments that had stood as symbols of strength and ingenuity were reduced to rubble. The very fabric of space itself seemed to twist and tear, folding in upon itself, a cosmic rift swallowing everything in its path. The creatures, or perhaps entities of that civilization, those who had once ruled over this planet, were seen frantically trying to understand the phenomena, desperately seeking answers. They weren't facing an army, but a process, a slow, methodical disintegration of everything they had known. Time itself seemed to stretch and distort, with people and structures simply vanishing. As the hologram zoomed in on the last moments of the civilization's destruction, Cade could hear a faint voice. It was almost drowned out by static, but it was unmistakable. We are not alone. It comes for us all. It is inevitable. The fabric unravels. The voice, broken and panicked, left Cade shaken to his core. The message had been clear. This was not a battle that could be won. There was no military strategy that would save humanity from what was coming. What lay ahead was not a war of weapons or armies, but a far greater, more insidious force, one that would leave no trace of humanity behind. The enemy wasn't a species or an army, it was entropy itself, a cosmic decay that consumed everything, slowly and without mercy. The artifact's significance was clearer now, but that did little to alleviate the crushing weight of reality that hung over Cade's team. As they stood in the ruins, staring at the crumbling stone tablet, the gravity of the situation began to sink in. There was no escaping this. The enemy was already on its way, and humanity was woefully unprepared. The sun, distant and cold, cast long shadows over the barren surface of the moon. Cade felt his body grow heavier with each passing second. The task ahead, though urgent, seemed almost futile. How could humanity possibly hope to survive something as unstoppable as this? How could they fight an enemy that didn't need to fight at all? Time itself would destroy them. "We have to warn them," Cade said, his voice a rasp. His team, gathered around the tablet, didn't answer immediately. Each of them was still processing the same horrifying realization. The artifacts were not weapons. They were the remnants of a failed society, a cautionary tale. And now, humanity was poised to repeat history. A soft voice from the team broke the silence. "Dr. Cade, what does this mean? What do we do with this? We've got the truth, but what use is it if we can't stop it?" Cade turned to face the speaker, a young scientist named Mara, who had joined the team with a blend of idealism and optimism. Now that optimism was dimming. "We don't stop it," Cade replied quietly. "We can't. This isn't something we can fight." Her face paled. "Then What's the point? We should just give up?
No!
Cade snapped, his voice more forceful than he intended. We don't give up. We need to understand the full scope of this. We need to know how they survived. This civilization, they fought back somehow. We need to learn everything we can from their failures. That's the only chance we have. A grim silence fell over the group. They all knew, deep down, that the task ahead was not just about survival. It was about finding meaning in the face of something that could not be stopped. There was no victory here, only the possibility of survival for as long as possible. Back on Earth, the news of their discovery had already begun to spread, and the shock waves it sent rippled outward like a stone thrown into a pond. The global community, already on edge from the collapse of power and the fracturing of alliances, now faced the undeniable truth. The enemy was coming, and it wasn't something they could simply strike down. A sense of despair took hold of many governments, and some, like the United States and China, began to mobilize their military forces, not to fight the enemy, but to establish control over the remaining resources that might give them some chance of survival. Others, like the European Union, tried to take a more measured approach, focusing on the scientific knowledge they could glean from the artifact. But across the board, one thing was clear. The panic was growing. The panic didn't just stay in the halls of power. It seeped into the streets. In cities around the world, protests erupted. People had always feared the end of the world, but now they were seeing the possibility of it becoming real. With the collapse of infrastructure and the growing unrest, humanity was slipping toward anarchy. Governments that once seemed unshakable were beginning to fracture. Their authority challenged at every turn. Some world leaders proposed solutions, building massive underground bunkers, evacuating to other planets, or simply stockpiling resources in preparation for a long, dark future. But none of these options could truly guarantee survival. In the face of a force like entropy, what was the point of all that effort? In the midst of this global turmoil, Cade and his team were working tirelessly to decipher the remaining fragments of information they had uncovered. They had been provided with ancient blueprints and incomplete systems, but there were no clear instructions. The language of the civilization was unlike anything they had encountered before. It was symbolic, layered with meaning that was difficult to unpack. Yet, as they sifted through the data, some patterns began to emerge. One of the most persistent symbols was that of a large structure, a complex network of interconnected pathways that seemed to be designed to prevent the inevitable collapse. Cade, though exhausted, was driven by a singular purpose. He had to understand this. He had to find the key to survival, the one piece of knowledge that might make a difference, however slim that chance might be. He worked late into the night, scanning every bit of data they had collected, hoping for a breakthrough, praying for something they could use. It was then that he saw it. A diagram, hidden among the artifacts. The shape was alien to him, but it was unmistakable in its purpose. A device, built by the ancient civilization, meant to slow or even halt the advance of entropy itself. It was not a weapon in the conventional sense, but something more complex, a mechanism designed to stabilize the very fabric of space-time, to counteract the destructive forces at play. The realization hit Cade like a bolt of lightning. If such a device existed, then it was humanity's only hope, not for victory, but for survival. If they could somehow reconstruct it, they might be able to buy themselves more time, to slow the inevitable collapse long enough for humanity to figure out a way to escape the coming destruction. "Everyone gather round," Cade called, his voice tinged with urgency. His team, exhausted but still hopeful, gathered around him as he pointed to the diagram on the holographic screen. "This is what we need. This is our only chance." One of the team members, a seasoned engineer named Rafe, frowned as he studied the diagram. "You think we can build this? With what? The technology we have is barely enough to keep the lights on, let alone create something like this." "We have no choice," Cade replied, his voice firm. If we don't try, we'll never know if it could work, and without it, we don't have any hope at all." There was a long pause, the weight of their circumstances hanging heavily between them, but after a moment Rafe nodded. "Then, let's get to work." The team set to work immediately, using every resource they had available to begin construction. Time was their enemy, but the knowledge they had was their only chance. The world outside was descending into madness, but inside the cold, silent laboratory, they held on to the last glimmer of hope. As they worked, Cade's mind raced. The device they were trying to build was a last-ditch effort, but it was also the only thing that could give humanity a fighting chance. If it worked, they might be able to buy the time they needed to figure out how to escape the inevitable. But if it didn't, the end was not far off. And even as the team worked on the device, Cade knew that the enemy was getting closer. The process of entropy was already spreading across the galaxy, creeping ever closer to Earth. It was only a matter of time before it reached them, and when it did, nothing would be left. All they could do now was build, and hope that the ancient civilization's last-ditch effort to survive would work.